Hello everyone and welcome to the AWS Certified Developer Associate Practice Quiz Series. Are you ready to validate your skills in developing, deploying, and debugging cloud-based applications on AWS? In this video, we'll practice 25 challenging, exam-style questions with their correct answer, explanation on why it is correct and why others are not correct. This is a critical step in your certification journey. Grab a notebook, pause the video after each question, and let's test your knowledge. Let the practice begin.
A developer is building a secure financial application and must enforce multi-factor authentication for user logins. Which AWS service provides built-in MFA support for application authentication? Correct answer, Amazon Cognito with MFA. Explanation: Amazon Cognito offers native multi-factor authentication support specifically for application users, making it the best choice for implementing MFA during login. Why others are incorrect? AWS IAM with MFA enabled only protects AWS console or API users, not application end users. DynamoDB plus SNS requires building a custom MFA workflow, not a managed solution. AWS Directory Service, intended for enterprise directory integration, not customer app authentication. For a company to process incoming documents from an Amazon S3 bucket. User upload document to an S3 bucket using a web user interface. Upon receiving file in S3, Lambda function is invoked to process this file, but the Lambda function times out intermittently. If the Lambda function is configured with the default settings, what will happen to the S3 event when there is a timeout exception? Correct answer, the S3 event is discarded after being retried twice. Explanation: S3 invokes Lambda synchronously, and Lambda automatically retries the event 2 more times. After that, the event is dropped. Why others are incorrect? Sent to DLQ, DLQ works only for asynchronous Lambda triggers, not S3. Retries until successful, S3 does not retry indefinitely. SNS email alert, S3 rightward arrow Lambda does not send failure notifications by default. For AWS code deploy to successfully run a deployment, where must the appspec.yml file be located within the application source structure? Correct answer, in the root directory of the application source. Explanation: code deploy requires the appspec.yml file to be located in the root of the source bundle, otherwise, the deployment will fail. Why others are incorrect? Bin folder, code deploy does not scan compiled output directories. Config files folder, code deploy expects the file only in the root path. S3 bucket, the source bundle may be stored in S3, but the appspec.yml must still be inside that bundle's root. A developer created a CPU-intensive AWS Lambda function and wants it to run faster and return responses more quickly. Which action will improve its performance? Correct answer, increase the function's memory. Explanation: AWS Lambda allocates CPU power proportionally to the amount of memory configured. So when you increase memory, you automatically get more CPU, including more CPU share or even additional cores at higher memory settings. Why others are incorrect? Increase the function's timeout only extends allowed runtime, does not improve CPU speed. Increase the function's reserved concurrency controls how many functions run at once, not how fast one runs. Increase the function's CPU core count. Lambda doesn't let you set CPU cores directly, CPU scales only with memory. A developer manages multiple code branches for a serverless web application and wants to deploy new versions without having to update the API gateway integration each time. Which approach enables seamless code pushes while keeping the same API gateway endpoint? Correct answer: use Lambda versions and aliases. Explanation: Lambda aliases allow API gateway to always invoke a stable alias like prod, while the developer updates which version the alias points to, removing the need to reconfigure API gateway. Why others are incorrect? Tag Lambda functions: tags do not influence routing or integration behavior. Multiple Lambda functions on one endpoint, API gateway can integrate with only one Lambda per method. Multiple stages still require updating integrations and do not solve the rerouting problem. An Amazon RDS MySQL instance named MySQLDB was deleted within the last 90 days. A developer needs to identify which IAM user or role performed the deletion. Which AWS service provides this information? Correct answer: review CloudTrail logs for DeleteDB instance events. Explanation: CloudTrail records all RDS API operations, including who initiated the DeleteDB instance action, making it the correct source for this information. Why others are incorrect? CloudWatch logs contains DB engine logs, not administrative API actions. Systems Manager inventory does not track RDS deletion activity. X-ray traces used for application request tracing, not RDS administrative actions. A company is running a custom application on on-premises Linux servers. These servers are accessed through Amazon API Gateway, and AWS X-ray is already enabled on the API Gateway test stage. What is the simplest way for a developer to enable X-ray tracing on the on-premises servers? Correct answer: install and run the X-ray daemon on the on-premises servers to capture and relay the data to the X-ray service. Explanation: to enable AWS X-ray tracing for applications running outside AWS, such as on-premises servers, the X-ray daemon must be installed and running. The daemon buffers trace data generated by the X-ray SDK and sends it to the X-ray service. This requires minimal configuration and is the recommended approach for hybrid or on-premises environments. Why others are incorrect? Put telemetry records via Lambda: this requires building a custom solution, shipping logs manually, and using Lambda unnecessarily, far more complex than installing the daemon. X-ray SDK alone: the SDK can generate trace data, but it cannot send data directly to X-ray. It still requires the X-ray daemon to relay the traces. Put trace segments via Lambda: again, this is a custom and complex architecture. Lambda-based relay is not needed when the X-ray daemon already handles this function efficiently. A developer's application running on a burstable nano Amazon EC2 instance is inserting items into a DynamoDB table that uses provisioned capacity. The application is failing with provision throughput exceed exception errors. What two actions should the developer take to fix the issue? Correct answers: reduce the frequency of requests to DynamoDB by implementing exponential backoff, and change the DynamoDB table capacity mode from provision to on-demand. Explanation: a provision throughput exceed exception occurs when the application exceeds the table's configured read or write capacity. To resolve this with the least friction, exponential backoff helps prevent request flooding and allows DynamoDB to recover. On-demand mode automatically scales capacity to match workload, eliminating manual provisioning issues. This is ideal when workloads are unpredictable or spiky. Together, these steps ensure the app can handle bursts without hitting provision throughput limits. Why others are incorrect? Move the application to a larger EC2 instance. EC2 instance size does not affect DynamoDB throughput or throttling. Throughput is controlled by DynamoDB's capacity settings. Increase RCUs. The errors are related to writes, not necessarily reads. The question states the application is inserting data, so RCUs are irrelevant. Increase the frequency of requests. This makes throttling worse. You should increase retry delay, not decrease it. A company has several VPC endpoints in the same VPC. A developer must create an S3 bucket policy that ensures the bucket can be accessed only through those specific VPC endpoints. Which configuration meets the requirement? Correct answer: use one bucket policy with multiple AWS source VPS values in a string equals condition, listing all the VPC endpoint IDs. Explanation: to restrict S3 access to specific VPC endpoints, you must explicitly allow access only from those endpoint IDs using the condition key AWS source VPS with string equals. You can list multiple endpoint IDs in the same policy. Why others are incorrect? Create different bucket policies for each VPC endpoint. Using string not equals would deny access through allowed endpoints. Also, multiple policies are unnecessary. Use AWS source VPC with string not equals. This restricts by VPC, not by endpoint. Users could still bypass restrictions using other VPC access methods. Use wildcard matching with string not equals. Wildcards do not guarantee only the intended endpoints can access the bucket and misconfigure access control. A customer wants to deploy new application code to an Elastic Beanstalk environment. They want minimal downtime and must reuse existing instances so that application access logs remain intact. Which deployment strategy should they choose? Correct answer: deploy using rolling updates. Explanation: rolling deployments update instances in batches, keeping the environment running while reusing existing instances, ensuring minimal downtime and preserving access logs. Why others are incorrect? All at once causes full downtime because all instances are replaced simultaneously. Immutable creates new instances during deployment, so existing logs are not retained. Rolling with an additional batch still adds extra instances temporarily, not meeting the requirement to use only existing instances. A team is testing an application running on EC2 instances and receives errors when the instances attempt to access an S3 bucket. Which troubleshooting steps should they perform? Correct answers: verify that the IAM role attached to the EC2 instance has an S3 access policy. And review the S3 bucket policy to confirm access is allowed. Explanation: EC2 instances access AWS services using the IAM role assigned to the instance profile. Both the instance role policy and the bucket policy must explicitly allow the access. Why others are incorrect? IAM user permissions: EC2 instances use IAM roles, not IAM users. S3 lifecycle policy: lifecycle rules relate to data transition/deletion, not access permissions. Security groups: security groups do not control access to S3. S3 is accessed over the public endpoint unless using VPC endpoints. A developer uses a BGP-enabled AWS VPN connection to access EC2 instances. They can reach an instance in subnet A but not in subnet B within the same VPC. Which AWS log source can help confirm whether traffic is reaching subnet B? Correct answer, VPC flow logs. Explanation, VPC flow logs capture network traffic at the subnet or ENI level, allowing the developer to check whether traffic is reaching subnet B. Why others are incorrect? CloudTrail tracks API calls, not network traffic flow. VPN logs show tunnel status, not traffic inside the VPC. BGP logs show route exchanges, not whether packets reached the subnet. A serverless application must trigger a Lambda function whenever changes occur in a DynamoDB table. How should the developer configure the Lambda to detect these changes? Correct answer, use DynamoDB streams and connect the stream to Lambda. Explanation, DynamoDB streams provide a native changelog feed that can directly trigger a Lambda function. Why others are incorrect? Event bridge polling, inefficient and does not detect real-time changes. Firehose, not supported as a stream source for DynamoDB changes. Kinesis data streams, not attachable directly to DynamoDB tables. A web app stores clickstream data in Kinesis streams, which may remain there for up to 12 hours. What is the correct way to implement encryption at rest for this data? Correct answer, enable server-side encryption for Kinesis. Explanation, Kinesis Streams supports server-side encryption using AWS KMS, providing seamless encryption at rest. Why others are incorrect? KCL helps with consuming data, not encrypting it. Lambda encryption adds complexity and latency unnecessarily. SSL only encrypts data in transit, not at rest. A developer needs to encrypt new S3 objects and maintain an audit trail of key usage without impacting application performance. Which encryption method meets these needs? Correct answer, server-side encryption with AWS KMS, Managed Keys, SSEKMS. Explanation, SSEKMS provides encryption at rest and logs all key usage in CloudTrail, ensuring an audit trail with no application performance impact. Why others are incorrect? SSES3, no audit trail of key usage. Client-side symmetric key, no centralized audit trail, adds overhead. Client-side KMS encryption, adds latency and complexity. A company is migrating its on-premises database to Amazon RDS for MySQL. The workload is read-heavy, and the development team wants to modify their application to achieve the best possible read performance. What should they do? Correct answer, configure the application to use a read replica through a replica endpoint. Explanation, read replicas in RDS are specifically designed for offloading read traffic, improving performance for read-intensive applications. Why others are incorrect? Retry logic helps with transient errors, not read performance. Multi-AZ, for high availability, not improved read throughput. EC2 replica, unnecessary and harder to manage than native RDS replicas. A company needs a scalable, low-maintenance AWS service to manage complex data ingestion and processing workflows. The service must run multiple business rules in a specific sequence and automatically handle retries and error reprocessing within the flow. Which service is best suited for this data flow orchestration? Correct answer, AWS Step Functions. Explanation, step functions provide workflow orchestration with sequencing, retries, and error handling ideal for complex multi-step data pipelines. Why others are incorrect. Lambda executes code, but doesn't orchestrate multi-step workflows. Glue ETL service, not suited for workflow-level orchestration logic. Batch, used for batch jobs, not sequential rule-based orchestration. A developer is building a serverless application which is based on AWS Lambda. Developer initializes the AWS SDK outside of the Lambda handler function. What is the primary benefit of this action? Correct answer, takes advantage of Lambda execution environment reuse. Explanation, initializing the SDK outside the handler allows AWS Lambda to reuse the SDK object across invocations, reducing cold start latency and improving performance. Why others are incorrect. Readability, not the main benefit. Error handling, unrelated to SDK placement. New instance creation, opposite of what actually happens. A serverless application needs to query an Amazon RDS database. The database resides in the private subnet of a custom VPC, VPCA, but the Lambda function is running in the default VPC. Given the Lambda function's current inability to connect, what is the most appropriate architectural solution to establish a secure, private network link between the two VPCs to enable database access? Correct answer, deploy the Lambda function into the same VPC and subnet as the database. Explanation, for Lambda to reach an RDS instance in a private subnet, the Lambda function must be configured to run inside the same VPC, or a VPC connected via networking. Why others are incorrect. Wide open ports, unsafe and still doesn't solve cross-VPC networking. SG rule alone, fails because Lambda isn't in the correct VPC. IAM role, IAM permissions don't provide network connectivity. A developer needs to deploy a new, incompatible version of an API, v2, while keeping the older version, v1, running and accessible for 6 months. How can the developer use Amazon API Gateway to achieve this parallel operation and provide a distinct endpoint for the new version? Correct answer, deploy a new stage, v2, in API Gateway and share its URL with clients. Explanation, API versioning is handled through separate stages. Clients can continue using v1 while transitioning to v2. Why others are incorrect. Lambda URLs, bypasses API Gateway entirely. CloudFront, not necessary for API versioning. Phased deployments, used for deployment shifts, not long-term version coexistence. A company is testing a container deployment model for its first AWS migration. To ensure the POC is deployed quickly and requires the least possible ongoing maintenance of the underlying infrastructure, which combination of serverless or managed container steps is optimal? Correct answers, deploy the container on ECS with AWS Fargate. And build a Docker image and push it to ECR. Explanation, ECR plus ECS Fargate is the simplest, fully managed way to deploy containers without managing servers, clusters, or EC2 instances. Why others are incorrect. Zip packaging, not for containers. EKS, requires more configuration and cluster management. EC2 plus code deploy, high operational overhead. A developer needs to build an event-driven workflow where an AWS Lambda function automatically executes to process data immediately after it arrives in an S3 bucket. What is the fundamental mechanism the developer must set up to ensure the S3 upload event directly and synchronously invokes the Lambda function in near real time? Correct answer, add an S3 trigger to the Lambda function. Explanation, S3 rightward arrow Lambda triggers are the standard mechanism for immediate invocation when new objects are uploaded. Why others are incorrect? Asynchronous invocation, not how event sources are configured. Event bridge, S3 upload rightward arrow event bridge is limited and unnecessary. Layers, cannot be used as event sources. A code deploy application needs secure access to database credentials and API keys. Which option requires the least administrative overhead? Correct answer, use SSM parameter store for secure secret storage. Explanation, SSM parameter store, with secure string, is the simplest, fully managed solution for securely storing and retrieving secrets. Why others are incorrect? S3, more manual management and not ideal for secrets. Metadata, unsafe and not designed for secrets. DynamoDB encryption, complex and unnecessary. The report generation process, executed by an AWS Lambda function, is now constrained by an external API's minute and daily rate limits. The developer must refactor the application to handle these limits, possibly delaying the completion over multiple days. Considering operational efficiency and minimizing serverless code complexity, what architectural change should be implemented to manage the intermittent execution, state tracking, and eventual completion of the report generation? Correct answer, use step functions with wait states for throttling. Explanation, step functions allow controlled sequencing, waiting, retrying, and breaking work across hours or days while staying fully serverless. Why others are incorrect? SQS, doesn't enforce per minute or per day API limits automatically. CloudWatch alarms, stops the function but doesn't manage throttling logic. Firehose, not suitable for API rate limited workflows. A company has sensitive documents in a private Amazon S3 bucket. To allow authenticated employees to securely share and access these files via a serverless web application without making the bucket public, which specific AWS mechanism should the application use to grant time-limited, temporary access to the S3 objects? Correct answer, S3 pre-signed URLs. Explanation, pre-signed URLs give time-limited, secure access to private S3 objects and are ideal for user-to-user file sharing. Why others are incorrect? Bucket policies, static permissions, not for per-user secure sharing. Cognito user pool, handles authentication, not file access. Identity pool, issues AWS credentials but still requires custom logic for sharing.